좋아요와 구독은 영상을 만드는 데 많은 도움이 됩니다.
See, hear and study.
Fine wares to sell. Fine wares to sell. Snow White peeped out of the window and cried. Good day, good woman, what have you to sell? Good wares, fine wares, answered she, laces of all colors. And she held up a piece that was woven of variegated silk. I need not be afraid of letting in this good woman, thought Snow White. And she unbarred the door and bought the pretty lace. What a figure you are, child, said the old woman. Come and let me lace you properly for once. Snow White, suspecting nothing, stood up before her, and let her lace her with the new lace. But the old woman laced so quick and tight that it took Snow White's breath away. And she fell down as dead. Now you have done with being the fairest, said the old woman as she hastened away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground, without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she was laced they cut the lace in two. Then she began to draw breath, and little by little she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened they said, the old peddler woman was no other than the wicked queen. You must beware of letting anyone in when we are not here. And when the wicked woman got home, she went to her glass and said, Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all? And it answered as before, Queen, thou art of beauty rare. But Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair. When she heard that she was so struck with surprise that all the blood left her heart. For she knew that Snow White must still be living. But now, said she, I will think of something that will be her ruin. And by witchcraft she made a poisoned comb. Then she dressed herself up to look like another different sort of old woman. So she went across the 7 mountains, and came to the house of the 7 dwarfs. And knocked at the door and cried, Good wares to sell! Good wares to sell! Snow White looked out and said, Go away, I must not let anybody in. But you are not forbidden to look, said the old woman, taking out the poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the poor child so much that she was tempted to open the door. And when the bargain was made the old woman said, Now, for once your hair shall be properly combed. Poor Snow White, thinking no harm, let the old woman do as she would. But no sooner was the comb put in her hair than the poison began to work. And the poor girl fell down senseless. Now, you paragon of beauty, said the wicked woman. This is the end of you, and went off. By good luck it was now near evening, and the 7 little dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as dead, They thought directly that it was the stepmother's doing, and looked about, found the poisoned comb. And no sooner had they drawn it out of her hair than Snow White came to herself, and related all that had passed. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard, and never again to let anyone in at the door. And the queen went home and stood before the looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking-glass answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare." But Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair. When she heard the looking-glass speak thus she trembled and shook with anger. "Snow White shall die," cried she, "though it should cost me my own life." And then she went to a secret lonely chamber, where no one was likely to come. And there she made a poisonous apple. It was beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who should see it must long for it. But whoever ate even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready she painted her face, and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. And when she knocked at the door Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anybody in, the 7 dwarfs told me not." "All right," answered the woman. "I can easily get rid of my apples elsewhere, there I will give you one." "No," answered Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side, I will have the white one." For the apple was so cunningly made, that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple. And as she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth, than she fell to the earth as dead. And the queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony. This time the dwarfs will not be able to bring you to life again." And when she went home and asked the looking-glass, "Looking-glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" At last it answered, "You are the fairest now of all." Then her envious heart had peace, as much as an envious heart can have. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground, and there came no breath out of her mouth. And she was dead. They lifted her up, sought if anything poisonous was to be found, cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but all was of no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. Then they laid her on a bier, and sat all 7 of them round it, and wept and lamented 3 whole days. And then they would have buried her. but that she looked still as if she were living, with her beautiful blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the black ground." And they had made a coffin of clear glass, so as to be looked into from all sides. And they laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch. And the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and lastly, a dove. Now, for a long while Snow White lay in the coffin and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep. For she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the wood, and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw on the mountain the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it. And he read what was written in golden letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you like to ask for it." But the dwarfs told him, that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it me, for I cannot live without looking upon Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you to great honor, and care for you as if you were my brethren." When he so spoke, the good little dwarfs had pity upon him, and gave him the coffin. And the king's son called his servants and bid them carry it away on their shoulders. Now it happened that as they were going along they stumbled over a bush, and with the shaking the bit of poisoned apple flew out of her throat. It was not long before she opened her eyes, threw up the cover of the coffin, and sat up, alive and well. "Oh dear! Where am I?" cried she. The king's son answered, full of joy, "You are near me." And, relating all that had happened, he said, "I would rather have you than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle and you shall be my bride." And Snow White was kind, and went with him. And their wedding was held with pomp and great splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. And when she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went to her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" The looking-glass answered, "O Queen, although you are of beauty rare, the young bride is 1,000 times more fair." Then she railed and cursed, and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First she thought she would not go to the wedding. But then she felt she should have no peace until she went and saw the bride. And when she saw her she knew her for Snow White, and could not stir from the place for anger and terror. For they had ready red-hot iron shoes, in which she had to dance until she fell down dead.